The winter of 1941 settled over America with a sense of disbelief that had not yet turned into direction. Pearl Harbor's ruins still smoldered, battleships lay capsized like monuments to an old world, and the Pacific Fleet, once a symbol of national security, had been gutted in a single morning. Newspapers displayed the twisted metal of the USS Arizona and Oklahoma, and what the public saw as tragedy, military planners saw as a looming strategic catastrophe. If Japan could do this in the Pacific, and if Germany mastered the Atlantic with its U-boats, then America faced a two-ocean war with a navy that had, overnight, become dangerously insufficient. The shock did not merely affect morale. It exposed vulnerabilities that demanded industrial action on a scale no nation had ever attempted. Across Washington, naval officials pored over intelligence reports with a growing sense of urgency. Hitler's U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate that outpaced replacements, creating a widening gap between need and capacity. Convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons to Britain disappeared beneath the waves faster than American shipyards could build the vessels to replace them. Without a drastic increase in production, and fast, the Atlantic lifeline would fail, and an isolated Britain would face collapse. America had the resources, talent, and territory to build ships in unprecedented numbers, but the question was whether these capabilities could be mobilized quickly enough to stop a naval disaster from unfolding in real time. The U-boat war was unlike anything naval planners had seen. German submarines operated in coordinated wolf packs, striking supply convoys with ruthless efficiency. Torpedoed merchant ships burned in the night, their flames visible from coastal towns along the American eastern seaboard. In the early months of 1942, U-boats sank ships faster than the United States could replace them, sometimes 5 or 6 in a single evening. The Atlantic, once a vital corridor of Allied cooperation, had become a graveyard of steel. For America, the lesson was clear. The nation could not merely build ships. It had to build them faster than the enemy could destroy them. This crisis demanded an industrial miracle, and shipyards became the epicenter of national mobilization. Timber, steel, concrete, and labor were marshaled in quantities that dwarfed previous projects. Construction sites expanded overnight, swallowing entire neighborhoods to make room for ways, slipforms, and cranes. At the heart of this transformation lay a new philosophy. Ships would no longer be crafted as singular works of naval artistry, but produced as standardized, modular machines, pieces of a vast assembly line that stretched from Oregon to Maine. Industrialists, engineers, labor unions, and government agencies formed an alliance that would redefine naval warfare. Factories that had once produced locomotives, automobiles, or farming equipment were retooled to forge propellers, turbines, and hull plates. Small coastal towns exploded into industrial hubs almost overnight, swollen with workers drawn by wages, patriotism, or simple necessity. Women, long excluded from heavy shipbuilding work, stepped onto the yard floors with torque wrenches, welding torches, and rivet guns, reshaping the American workforce as profoundly as the ships they constructed. Migrants from the Deep South, Appalachia, and the Midwest poured into industrial regions, transforming not only the composition of the workforce but the cultural geography of the nation. Central to this transformation was the Liberty ship, an unglamorous, boxy, utilitarian vessel designed not for elegance or speed, but for mass production and functionality. Engineers stripped away every element of unnecessary complexity, replacing riveted construction with welded seams that allowed ships to be assembled in sections and joined rapidly. Every Liberty ship was a floating assertion of American industrial might, created not to impress but to endure. The shipyards responsible for producing them became laboratories of efficiency, evolving into the most advanced industrial sites on Earth. As the first Liberty ships slid down the ways, naval officials watched with cautious optimism. These vessels were not warships. They were lifelines, meant to outnumber and outlast the U-boats rather than outrun them. What mattered was not individual perfection, but relentless volume. The philosophy was simple. If Germany sank 10 ships, America would build 20. If U-boats adapted, American engineers would innovate faster. If production slowed, labor forces would expand, techniques would improve, and management would be reorganized. Victory in the Atlantic would belong not to the side with the deadliest submarine, but to the nation capable of sustaining the longest industrial breath. By the end of this first phase, it became clear that America's real power was not in its damaged battleships or its temporarily weakened fleet, but in its unmatched capacity to build anew. What the enemy hoped would cripple the United States had instead awakened its greatest strength, an industrial system capable of producing ships at a speed the world had never imagined. The challenge was immense, but so was the response, and the race between construction and destruction had only just begun. As 1942 began, the Atlantic Ocean became the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. German U-boats prowled the coastline like predators in a feeding frenzy, attacking merchant ships so close to American shores that citizens on beaches reported hearing the explosions and seeing flames reflected on the water. The Kriegsmarine called it Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat, and it was, in its early months, astonishingly successful. Merchant ships sailed without proper escorts or blackout procedures, making them easy targets. Night after night, a grim tally grew. Tankers burning, cargo ships broken in half, sailors cast helplessly into oil-coated waters. The scale of loss was unsustainable. America needed ships, and it needed them immediately. In Washington, naval strategists were not just alarmed, they were panicked. Britain's survival depended on the flow of supplies, and every ship sunk represented more than lost cargo. It meant lost lives, lost time, and lost strategic initiative. Reports arrived daily. Convoys disrupted, food shipments destroyed, critical equipment lying at the bottom of the sea. The fear was not abstract, it was mathematical. If losses continued at their current pace, the Allies would face collapse within months. No amount of courage at sea could compensate for a simple equation. Ships were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. America's shipyards had to reverse that equation. At the center of this industrial revival stood the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, a sweeping initiative that marshaled federal funds, private industry, labor, and raw materials into a single purpose. The program was not a mere expansion of existing facilities. It was the construction of an entirely new industrial ecosystem. Shipyards rose from empty coastline, transformed from paper blueprints to steel realities with breathtaking speed. Contracts were signed, land seized, equipment rushed into place, and thousands of workers hired within weeks. The government took unprecedented control over logistics, materials, and production schedules, turning a patchwork of shipyards into a synchronized national machine. The scale of the mobilization required a new kind of management. Traditional shipbuilding techniques, slow, artisanal, and dependent on skilled craftsmen, had to be replaced by assembly line methods pioneered in the automobile industry. To many veteran builders, this shift seemed outrageous, even sacrilegious. Ships had always been handcrafted. Now engineers called for modular construction, prefabricated parts, and welding crews who could join steel plates in minutes rather than hours. Henry Kaiser, a maverick industrialist with no prior naval experience, championed this new vision, arguing that America must build ships like Detroit built cars, quickly, efficiently, and in overwhelming numbers. Kaiser's approach reshaped the shipyard floor. Instead of constructing a vessel from keel to mast in a single location, workers created entire sections, stern assemblies, midship blocks, bow segments, in parallel. These pieces were then moved by massive cranes and fitted together like an industrial puzzle. The result was a revolution in speed. What once took months could now be achieved in days. Welding replaced riveting, eliminating thousands of holes that required hand-fitting and fastening. Innovations were constant, driven as much by necessity as creativity. A new culture emerged, one in which speed was not the enemy of quality, but its measure. This new industrial tempo drew in an astonishing array of workers. Housewives who had never held a tool became welders, their faces lit by torch sparks. Retired men returned to labor, eager to contribute. Immigrants, farmers, students, and factory workers joined in, swelling the workforce into a vast and diverse army of laborers. Child care centers opened near shipyards so mothers could work double shifts. Housing developments sprang up to shelter incoming workers. Cafeterias served 24 hours a day. Shipyards, once sleepy industrial sites, became bustling cities within cities, alive with motion, noise, and purpose. Yet for all the ambition and activity, success was not guaranteed. Materials shortages, logistics bottlenecks, and inexperienced labor threatened to cripple production. Steel shipments arrived late, welding rods ran out, cranes broke down, and ships sometimes emerged with critical faults. But the pressure of wartime necessity fostered innovation at every turn. Workers adapted, managers reorganized, engineers redesigned faulty components, and crews learned from each error. The shipyards evolved rapidly, refining techniques, improving coordination, and building efficiency into every step of production. By spring of 1942, the first wave of Liberty ships was rolling out of American yards at a pace that had once seemed impossible. Launch ceremonies became almost routine as hull after hull slid into the water, flags waving and crowds cheering. These ships, austere and unadorned, represented far more than steel and cargo space. They were symbols of a nation's determination to defy destruction through creation. Every launch was a message to Hitler's U-boats. America was not intimidated. It was accelerating. And soon, the ocean would belong not to the hunters, but to the fleet rising from America's shores. The Liberty ship, crude in appearance and built for function rather than form, became the backbone of America's plan to reverse the tide of the Atlantic War. Derived from a British design but heavily modified for American mass production, the Liberty ship was not intended to inspire awe. It was intended to overwhelm the enemy through sheer quantity. Naval architects stripped away complexities, replacing riveted hulls with welded seams, simplifying systems, and embracing a modular structure that permitted simultaneous assembly across dozens of shipyards. The result was an uncompromising, workmanlike vessel built for a singular purpose: to survive long enough to deliver the goods that would keep Allied nations fighting. Each Liberty ship measured over 400 feet in length and carried nearly 10,000 tons of cargo. Its design was deliberately austere: one propeller, one triple expansion steam engine, and a modest top speed of about 11 knots. Critics dismissed the ships as ugly ducklings, doubting their durability and deriding their simplicity. But elegance was irrelevant. These ships were built to deliver tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, and fuel, not to engage the enemy. In an ocean where U-boats struck without warning, survival depended not on speed but on numbers. If 5 ships sailed and 1 was sunk, the mission still succeeded. Victory would come not from perfection but from persistence. The production numbers of Liberty ships reflected an industrial miracle without precedent. Kaiser's West Coast shipyards, once considered experimental, soon matched the output of the East Coast's traditional facilities. In the early months, building a Liberty ship required over 200 days. Within a year, that time had been slashed by more than half. Record-setting launches followed, ships built in mere weeks, then days. One legendary vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in an astonishing 4.5 days. Though the feat was largely symbolic and required intense planning, it demonstrated the extraordinary momentum of the American shipbuilding machine. Behind every completed ship was an enormous, coordinated dance of logistics. Steel plates arrived by rail from mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio, engines from Midwestern factories, wiring from New England, and sensors from California. This national supply network operated with relentless urgency, synchronized through schedules that tolerated no delays. A single late train could stall an entire hull section. Warehouse managers and shipping clerks, rarely celebrated, became vital cogs in the war effort, ensuring that shipyards received the materials they needed at the exact moment they were required. Laborers worked through blistering summers and freezing winters, often in dangerous conditions. Sparks rained down from scaffolding, welders crouched inside narrow hull sections breathing in fumes, and cranes swung massive assemblies overhead with only inches to spare. The noise was deafening, the pace exhausting, but morale ran high because workers understood the urgency of their task. They read the newspapers. They knew that their ships were delivering food to London during the Blitz, tanks to North Africa, and munitions to the Soviet Union. Each hull that entered the water was a contribution to the survival of free nations. As output increased, so did global reliance on American shipbuilding. British leaders praised the Liberty ships as instruments of salvation, while Soviet commanders regarded them as lifelines on the treacherous Murmansk run. Many of these supply routes bordered the Arctic Circle, where storms and German aircraft posed mortal danger. Liberty ships, built quickly and modestly, endured these journeys with surprising resilience. Their crews, often civilian mariners with little combat experience, faced torpedoes, freezing waters, and relentless pressure, all aboard vessels that symbolized American determination. The Liberty ship program also changed the nature of American society. Women welders and African-American laborers challenged long-standing barriers, proving their capability in the nation's most demanding industrial environments. Integration was imperfect and often resisted, but the shipyards became early battlegrounds for social transformation. As workers demonstrated their skill, prejudices weakened. The war forced America to reconsider who was allowed to contribute, and the shipyards became some of the first places where long-standing assumptions cracked beneath the weight of necessity. By the end of this phase, the Liberty ship had become more than a vessel. It was a symbol of industrial democracy, national unity, and strategic resilience. Hitler's U-boats were still sinking ships, but for the first time, America was building replacements faster than losses accumulated. The balance had not yet shifted decisively, but the trend was clear. The hunters of the Atlantic faced an enemy they could neither see nor attack. The vast industrial power of the United States, manifested in thousands of Liberty ships taking shape along the coasts and gliding into the ocean with unstoppable regularity. The winter of 1942 brought a brutal reckoning to the American coastline as German U-boats prowled the Atlantic like silent assassins, exploiting every weakness in America's still uncoordinated coastal defense. While city lights glowed along beaches from Florida to New Jersey, they acted as perfect silhouettes for merchant ships, bright backdrops against which U-boats could pick targets with deadly precision. Entire tankers erupted into infernos visible for miles. And yet the factories behind these tragedies absorbed each loss like fuel for a growing volcanic reaction. In Michigan, the River Rouge plant increased its night shifts. In Baltimore, Bethlehem Steel began operating under a no blackouts, no interruptions mandate. Every destroyed vessel became a statistic to avenge rather than mourn. This transformation, from shock to fury to mobilization, created a psychological engine that pushed American production into a realm few nations had ever witnessed. Even amid the escalating U-boat slaughter, shipyard managers began to recognize that the crisis was forcing design changes at a pace peacetime bureaucracy could never have tolerated. The U-boats were not merely destroying ships, they were shaping the next generation of them. Hull reinforcement began to be standardized, not debated. Lifeboat davits were redesigned after survivors reported failures under fire. Engineers found themselves sketching fixes on cafeteria napkins, passing them directly to foremen who integrated changes within hours instead of waiting weeks for formal approval. The war had eliminated the luxury of deliberation. In the crucible of necessity, America discovered a truth that would define its rise. Speed was not a trait, it was a weapon. And now that weapon was being sharpened daily by the escalating U-boat threat. As the tempo intensified, the U.S. Maritime Commission introduced an innovation so bold that it transformed shipbuilding philosophy itself, the modular construction blueprint. Traditional shipbuilding relied on slowly shaping the hull on a single slipway, a process that could take months before internal compartments were even added. The new concept shattered that tradition. Yards began assembling entire portions, bow sections, engine compartments, deckhouses, independently and simultaneously in massive sheds, then transporting them on enormous cranes to be welded together like pieces of a steel cathedral. This method compressed timelines in ways that seemed almost magical. A shipyard that once delivered 4 ships per year was now capable of 30. Germany had no conceptual equivalent, no industrial depth to replicate such scale. In this quiet revolution of engineering logic, the balance of the Atlantic War began to turn. Yet the shift was not merely technological, it was cultural. For decades, shipwrights had been masters of slow perfection, artisans of rivets and curvature. Welded ships, especially those built quickly, were initially met with disdain by old-school craftsmen who viewed welding as crude compared to riveting. But with the nation desperate for tonnage, and with younger welders proving they could work faster, safer, and at a fraction of the cost, tension simmered in the yards. Managers resolved this by assigning traditional riveters to critical load areas while allowing welders to handle bulk construction. Over time, even the skeptics began to admire the strength of welded plates under stress tests. What once divided the workforce now unified it, merging generations into a single purpose: build ships faster than the enemy could destroy them. Meanwhile, the influx of labor brought social transformation to the shipyards that paralleled the industrial one. Women, many of whom had never worked industrial jobs before, quickly proved indispensable. Their smaller hands and steady patience made them exceptional welders, pipe fitters, and precision assemblers. Early assumptions about unsuitable jobs for women evaporated as female welders achieved error rates significantly lower than inexperienced male trainees. Photographs later showed lines of women in heavy aprons and protective hoods, sparks cascading around them like meteors as they stitched together the hulls of Liberty ships destined for faraway oceans. In these yards, gender roles dissolved beneath the glare of arc welders. Skill, speed, and endurance became the only currencies that mattered. African American workers, long excluded from many industrial roles, began entering shipyards in increasing numbers, though often relegated to segregated crews or lower pay classifications. But the sheer demand for labor began bending these discriminatory barriers. Skilled black welders and machinists forced yard managers to confront the reality that the war could not be won while sidelining part of the nation's workforce. Some shipyards integrated shifts under federal pressure. Others did so silently as foremen discovered that the most skilled workers were too valuable to waste. These early cracks in segregation, driven not by ideology but by necessity, would later feed into the larger momentum of the post-war civil rights movement. In the shipyards, steel was not the only thing being reshaped. As America's mass production engine roared, a subtle but crucial development occurred: the standardization of components across fleets. Instead of building each ship class with bespoke parts, an old naval tradition, engineers pushed for interchangeable valves, pumps, gauges, and wiring systems. This allowed repair ships in the Atlantic or Pacific to carry universal spare parts rather than thousands of unique ones. A Liberty ship damaged in the North Atlantic could be serviced by parts originally destined for a ship in California. This logistical coherence, invisible to the public, dramatically increased operational uptime and reduced repair bottlenecks. Germany, constrained by resource shortages and leadership chaos, could not match such efficiency. America's industrial genius lay not only in making many things fast, but in making them all fit together. By the end of 1942, even as U-boats still prowled the ocean, the psychological dominance of Germany's submarine campaign was beginning to fracture. The shipyards were delivering hulls at a pace that simply outstripped destruction. For every vessel sunk, 2 more were launched, an inverse equation that Germany could not counteract. Shipyard workers began marking hull numbers on chalkboards like silent counterattacks, each new ship a rebuke to Nazi ambitions. The ocean, once a graveyard, was gradually transforming into a highway of steel reinforcements, ammunition, food, and fuel. America's shipyards had become an industrial tidal wave, and with each new launch, the war's momentum shifted further toward an Allied future. The spring of 1943 marked a turning point in the silent struggle between America's shipbuilders and Germany's U-boat commanders, though few realized it at the time. The convoys that had once been easy prey now sailed with increasingly confident escorts. Destroyer escorts produced in astonishing numbers by the very shipyards Hitler had hoped to incapacitate through early submarine dominance. These small, agile vessels were the unsung backbone of the Atlantic War, designed not for spectacle but for endurance. Their sonar systems, depth charge rails, and radar equipment reflected an evolution born of necessity. As more of them entered service, U-boat captains found themselves confronting a new reality. The ocean that once granted them shadows for protection had begun to glow with the watchful eyes of American technology. And behind those eyes stood the industrial miracles of coastal shipyards working under floodlights through the night. In the shipyards themselves, another transformation took root, the refinement of supply chain orchestration into a wartime science. Every yard began functioning as a nerve in a vast national organism, sharing materials, expertise, and even specialized labor when needed. Steel mills in Pennsylvania sent plate steel on tightly synchronized rail schedules to yards in Maine, Virginia, and California. Machine shops in Ohio manufactured identical turbine components destined for both Atlantic and Pacific fleets. Even inland cities, thousands of miles from salt water, became indispensable. St. Louis built steering assemblies. Detroit manufactured diesel engines. Birmingham produced anchor chain. The myth of coastal-centric shipbuilding dissolved as America's heartland filled the bloodstream of the naval machine. Hitler's naval intelligence never fully grasped the depth of this collaboration. Germany looked for shipbuilding at the water's edge, not realizing the warships began life in factories scattered across an entire continent. As the months passed, shipyard managers confronted mounting pressure to tighten workflow even further. The target was no longer building ships faster. It was building them predictably. Unexpected delays, however small, had cascading consequences. A missing batch of rivets could idle 100 welders. A crane breakdown could stall an entire slipway. To counter this, some yards introduced round-the-clock maintenance crews whose sole job was to ensure cranes, hoists, cutters, and welders functioned with machine-like reliability. Others adopted color-coded tracking boards where every subcomponent, hatches, ladders, ducts, bulkheads, was assigned a visible status marker. These innovations, primitive compared to modern logistics software, nonetheless improved consistency enough that ship completion dates became almost as reliable as calendar appointments. Germany's intelligence agencies, receiving reports of ships emerging in weeks rather than months, often dismissed them as exaggerations. But reality was growing stranger than propaganda. The United States had turned shipbuilding into something akin to a choreography of steel. This choreography extended to the very geography of shipyards, many of which underwent expansions so sweeping that entire neighborhoods were relocated. In Portland, Maine, apartment buildings were raised to make way for new plate shops. In Richmond, California, an entire rail spur was built exclusively to carry boilers from inland manufacturers directly to the slipways. Housing shortages for workers prompted the construction of enormous wartime dormitories, towns within towns, complete with cafeterias, hospitals, schools, and theaters. These would become the birthplace of cultural intersections on a scale the country had rarely seen. Migrants from the rural South lived beside West Coast machinists. Midwestern farmhands trained alongside New York metalworkers. The shipyards became a national melting pot accelerated by urgency, where regional divisions softened under the common rhythm of hammer strikes, welding arcs, and rolling steel. The technical evolution of the ships themselves accelerated at a similarly breathtaking pace. Early Liberty ships, designed primarily for cargo, were robust but unsophisticated. By 1943, the United States was introducing more advanced types, Victory ships, which were faster, more efficient, and equipped with finer engineering. Their turbines allowed them to outrun many submarines, and their structural improvements mitigated cold weather cracking, a flaw that had plagued earlier hulls. Engineers worked tirelessly to redesign joints, integrate stress relief patterns, and adopt new steel compositions. The result was not simply higher quality vessels, but a manufacturing process that embraced iteration with astonishing speed. A flaw reported off Iceland could lead to a design revision in Oregon by week's end. War compressed geographic and bureaucratic distance into irrelevance. Information moved as fast as the steel that followed it. Even as output soared, the human cost of sustaining such momentum became increasingly visible. Accidents in the shipyards, often overshadowed by battlefield casualties, nonetheless represented a significant toll. Welders working suspended dozens of feet in the air faced constant danger from falls, sparks, and collapsing scaffolding. Boiler rooms under construction sometimes exploded due to mishandled equipment or unseen pressure buildup. Medical tents, once considered temporary, expanded into full-time emergency centers staffed with surgeons who knew that treating industrial injuries had become a patriotic duty. Yet despite the risks, absenteeism remained remarkably low. Workers understood, perhaps more than anyone, the stakes of their labor. Every completed ship might mean hundreds of sailors returning home alive instead of vanishing into the Atlantic depths. What made the transformation even more extraordinary was the pace at which unskilled civilians became competent specialists. Trade schools across the nation operated at maximum capacity, offering intensive programs in welding, pipe fitting, blueprint reading, and electrical assembly. Thousands who had never touched industrial equipment entered shipyards months later as capable contributors. The learning curve was shortened by a culture of mentorship. Older craftsmen took pride in teaching recruits, seeing in them the nation's best chance to outpace the U-boat menace. In countless archived photographs, seasoned riveters stand beside teenage apprentices, guiding their hands, passing down war-forged wisdom that had never before been required at such scale. By transforming civilians into industrial warriors, America expanded not merely its labor pool, but its national identity. By late 1943, the results were unmistakable. The German U-boat strategy had begun to collapse under the weight of American production. Convoys were better defended, new ships were faster and more resilient, and losses, once catastrophic, became manageable. Admiral Karl Donitz, architect of the submarine campaign, privately admitted that Germany was no longer sinking ships faster than America could replace them. In that admission lay the beginning of defeat. For every submarine deployed, America countered with new escorts, new cargo ships, new anti-submarine technologies, all birthed from the roaring furnaces and electrified nights of its shipyards. The tide had turned not through any single battle, but through the relentless capacity of a nation that learned to turn its industrial heartbeat into a weapon of war. The early months of 1944 revealed the full maturity of America's shipbuilding revolution, as the once chaotic scramble for steel, labor, and expertise settled into a synchronized national rhythm. What had begun as a desperate response to a naval emergency had evolved into one of the most sophisticated industrial systems the world had ever seen. Yet this evolution was not merely organizational, it was philosophical. Shipyard leaders understood that victory was no longer about building enough ships. It was about building ships that could dominate every corner of the world's oceans simultaneously. This demand spurred the rise of a new class of vessels that required not just speed of production, but precision of engineering. Escort carriers, attack transports, replenishment ships, and amphibious landing craft. Each category represented a strategic shift in how America envisioned projecting power, and each depended on shipyards that had learned to innovate not in years, but in weeks. These changes reverberated across the shipyard's internal cultures, where experimentation gradually replaced tradition as the defining ethos. Blueprint revisions, once bureaucratic nightmares, became routine. Foremen encouraged engineers to walk the slipways, study bottlenecks firsthand, and speak directly with welders to test the feasibility of new concepts. This flattening of hierarchy proved revolutionary. Riveters offered insights on how design tweaks could shave hours off installation times. Electricians proposed routing strategies that simplified maintenance at sea. The result was a feedback loop in which the shipyards themselves became laboratories, testing ideas not in theoretical simulations, but in steel, sparks, and sweat. While Germany's war industries were strangled by rigid doctrine and political interference, America's thrived on agility, a contrast that would shape the war's ultimate trajectory. Amid this culture of innovation, the role of union leadership became quietly pivotal. Maritime unions, recognizing the national emergency, negotiated agreements that balanced worker protections with unprecedented flexibility. Overtime rules were adjusted to enable extended shifts. Jurisdictional disputes, which had previously caused costly work stoppages, were set aside through wartime accords. In some yards, specialized committees mediated disputes within hours rather than days. This harmony was not universal. Tensions flared in cities where racial segregation still shaped job assignments. But compared to pre-war conditions, it represented a monumental shift. For the first time, millions of industrial workers and the federal government functioned as partners rather than adversaries. This collaboration became one of the war's invisible engines, powering the shipbuilding miracle as surely as any turbine forged in a machine shop. Technological progress also surged through wartime necessity, transforming not only the ships but the tools used to build them. Oxyacetylene torches were supplemented by early electric arc welders of increasing power and precision. Pneumatic rivet guns became more ergonomic, reducing fatigue and improving accuracy. Giant gantry cranes, some taller than city buildings, were constructed specifically to move pre-assembled modules weighing dozens of tons. Even mundane tools like grinders and clamps were redesigned for faster use. These incremental improvements, scattered across thousands of tasks, compounded into dramatic gains. A slipway that once consumed 6 months to produce a hull could now complete one in less than 6 weeks. The technological leap was so substantial that foreign observers later remarked that wartime American shipyards resembled industrial battlefields, where the weapons were machines and the victories measured in tonnage. As production escalated, the sheer scale of materials required became staggering. Steel consumption skyrocketed to levels unmatched in history. Lumber for scaffolding, copper wiring, brass fittings, rubber seals, and precision bearings had to be sourced from every region of the continent. The logistical challenge of supplying such volume threatened to overwhelm the system until the War Production Board introduced a hierarchy of allocation that prioritized shipyards producing essential escort vessels and transports. Railroads became arteries pulsing with ceaseless freight, trains hauling plate steel, pipes, and machinery. Entire timetables were rewritten so that military cargo took precedence over commercial traffic. The supply chain grew so vast that it constituted a shadow economy in itself, a nationwide web of production in which even small-town foundries and machine shops played crucial roles. Germany never anticipated that America could mobilize resources at this scale, and by the time its leaders understood, the industrial tide had already risen beyond their reach. Yet behind the statistics and steelwork lay the human dimension, stories of endurance, sacrifice, and pride that defined the shipyard communities. Families often lived by the rhythm of the shipyard whistle, waking before dawn to prepare meals for spouses and children heading into long shifts. Children grew up reciting hull numbers as if they were sports scores. Night shift workers trudged home beneath streetlights, faces smeared with soot, carrying the fatigue of 16-hour days with the quiet dignity of those who understood that history was being shaped in their hands. Communities rallied around these laborers, organizing blood drives, communal diners, and neighborhood support networks for injured workers and their families. It was wartime solidarity at its most local, yet its impact stretched across oceans, influencing battles thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, the tactical consequences of America's shipbuilding surge became evident across the global theater. In the Pacific, new destroyers, escorts, and supply ships enabled Admiral Nimitz to sustain long-range offensives that would have been impossible months earlier. In the Atlantic, convoys grew so well-defended that U-boat wolf packs found themselves hunted by aircraft and sonar-equipped escorts instead of stalking helpless merchantmen. Even in the Mediterranean, rapid reinforcement allowed the Allies to stabilize supply lines crucial for campaigns in North Africa and Italy. The global reach of American naval logistics became a defining feature of Allied strategy, a web of steel linking continents, powered by shipyards that worked around the clock without pause or mercy for the enemy. Germany's submarine commanders, once triumphant, now spoke of the ocean becoming too crowded with American steel. By late 1944, the towering success of the shipyards had become so overwhelming that it transcended wartime goals and spilled into the realm of mythology. Newspapers celebrated record launches. Newsreels showed crowds cheering as ships slid into the water, christened by factory workers rather than dignitaries. Roosevelt himself declared shipbuilders the arsenal workforce of democracy, recognizing their role in turning disaster into dominance. Yet perhaps the greatest testament to America's industrial triumph was this simple truth: the Navy no longer worried about running out of ships. Instead, it focused on how best to use the vast fleet arriving at its disposal. The anxiety that had once permeated Washington, fear that Germany could sink ships faster than America could build them, had vanished. In its place stood a confidence forged not in battle, but in the fires and furnaces of the shipyards. A new reality had emerged. By early 1945, The transformation within America's shipyards reached a level of sophistication unimaginable just a few years earlier. The war had forced these industrial giants to become more than places of production. They had become ecosystems, self-contained worlds where engineering, logistics, medicine, training, and human resilience merged into a single, focused purpose. Many shipyards had grown into sprawling complexes stretching for miles, lit through the night by towers of floodlights that gave the waterfront an otherworldly glow. To those who worked there, the shipyards felt like a city that never slept, its pulse set by the earth-shaking rumble of steel plates being maneuvered into place and the rhythmic percussion of pneumatic tools. Visitors were struck by the scale, the speed, and the raw sense of momentum. It was as if America had taken its entire industrial soul and concentrated it along the water's edge. Amid the constant construction, shipyards also became hubs of technological intelligence gathering. Naval officers returning from the Pacific or the Atlantic often visited the sites to share frontline insights with engineers and foremen. Their observations, how hulls performed under fire, how ventilation systems responded to tropical climates, how radar masts held up under Atlantic storms, directly informed adjustments in the next vessel under construction. This continuous feedback loop erased the usual boundaries between the war front and the home front. A destroyer damaged in combat could spark a design improvement implemented the very next week. In contrast, Germany's industrial apparatus struggled to adapt quickly. Political interference, resource shortages, and strategic confusion slowed innovation. America's shipyards, by comparison, operated like an intellectual conveyor belt, constantly absorbing lessons and producing increasingly refined warships. The psychological climate within the shipyards also shifted during this period. Workers began to understand that they were not merely contributing to the war, they were shaping its outcome. Reports of Allied victories circulated through lunchrooms, pinned to bulletin boards beside production targets and safety notices. When a worker saw a photograph of a convoy arriving safely in Britain or Marines landing on distant shores, they understood that a ship they helped build might have been there. This sense of shared purpose generated an emotional momentum every bit as powerful as the industrial one. The shipyards were no longer places of mere labor. They had become symbols of national resolve, where every completed hull represented not just steel and machinery, but sacrifice, unity, and the belief that freedom demanded collective effort. Even as the war neared its climax, the shipyards continued refining the modular construction methods that had revolutionized production. Assembly lines that once struggled to coordinate dozens of sections now handled hundreds with remarkable precision. Entire superstructures were built independently and lowered onto hulls with staggering accuracy, guided by teams of signalmen and crane operators who had developed a near-telepathic rapport after years of intense collaboration. Welding crews moved across these structures like synchronized dancers, sealing seams that stretched longer than city blocks. The modular system allowed shipyards to build multiple vessels in parallel, like massive steel jigsaw puzzles assembled from thousands of subcomponents created in factories across the nation. The faster the Allies advanced overseas, the more urgent the work became, pushing the limits of what human coordination and industrial machinery could achieve. The tempo of operations placed immense strain on the workers themselves. Fatigue was pervasive, especially among those who had labored nonstop since 1942. Yet the shipyards adapted with makeshift solutions, rotating shifts, expanded break facilities, rest stations equipped with cots, and medical staff dedicated to treating exhaustion and repetitive stress injuries. Childcare centers opened near many shipyards to support working mothers, allowing them to remain part of the labor force without compromising their families' well-being. Churches, civic groups, and volunteer organizations formed networks to deliver meals to workers too busy or too tired to cook at home. In these small yet profound ways, American communities became extensions of the shipyard floor, feeling the weight of the war, sharing in its burdens, and reinforcing the workers who built the ships that carried the nation's hopes. One of the most defining aspects of this era was the introduction of entirely new vessel types designed to support the evolving nature of global warfare. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, barracks craft, and floating repair docks rolled off the slipways with increasing regularity. These auxiliary ships, often overlooked in public celebrations, were indispensable to American strategy. They allowed U.S. fleets to operate far from port, sustaining campaigns across vast distances that Axis planners had never considered. In the Pacific especially, these support ships enabled the island-hopping strategy to function, allowing fleets to remain mobile, supplied, and ready for battle without tethering themselves to vulnerable bases. Each of these vessels reflected the shipyard's ability to pivot, innovate, and deliver whatever the war required at unprecedented speed. The ripple effects of America's shipbuilding triumph reached far beyond the battlefields. Allied nations increasingly relied on U.S. factories for the vessels necessary to keep their own fleets in operation. Britain received escort carriers and merchant ships at a pace that stabilized its global lifelines. The Soviet Union relied heavily on American-built transports and cargo ships to sustain the Arctic convoys. Australia and Canada integrated U.S.-built vessels into their maritime defense networks. The United States, once a nation known more for its manufacturing curiosity than its naval might, had become the beating heart of Allied logistics, a transformation so sweeping that it redefined global perceptions of American power. Shipyards that had barely been known outside their own states now exerted influence on strategies spanning 3 continents. By the end of this phase, America had achieved something that even its own leaders had doubted was possible in the dark days of 1942. It had built a navy and a merchant fleet, so vast, so capable, and so resilient that Germany's ambitions for naval dominance collapsed under its sheer weight. Submarines that once terrorized the Atlantic now struggled to find targets. Supply lines that had once seemed fragile now pulsed with uninterrupted strength. And behind it all stood the shipyards, monuments of steel and labor that had turned the tide of war not with weapons, but with the unstoppable force of national unity and industrial mastery. They had proven that democracy, when mobilized with purpose, could outproduce, out-innovate, and outlast even the most determined dictatorship. The final winter of the war brought a new sense of urgency to America's shipyards, not because Germany still posed a meaningful threat at sea, but because victory itself demanded unprecedented logistical preparation. The Allied High Command understood that the Pacific theater still required staggering quantities of naval power: more transports, more landing craft, more repair ships, more tankers, everything necessary to sustain amphibious assaults on fortified island chains, and, ultimately, a projected invasion of Japan. This looming confrontation placed immense pressure on shipyards already pushed to their limits, forcing them to dig even deeper into their reservoirs of skill, discipline, and innovation. Despite exhaustion and the emotional weight of 3 relentless years of production, workers pressed forward with determination. The knowledge that their labor would shape the end of the war, and perhaps save untold thousands of soldiers, imbued the yards with a solemn, purposeful energy. On the West Coast especially, shipyard expansions reached their peak. Kaiser's massive complexes in Richmond and Portland operated like mechanized kingdoms, where thousands of workers moved through carefully planned routines from dawn until long after sunset. Their slipways launched escort carriers, attack transports, and troop barges with a frequency that defied belief, transforming the quiet Pacific shoreline into one of the most active naval construction zones in human history. The sight of dozens of half-completed hulls stretching into the distance became a powerful metaphor for American persistence, a landscape of steel that signaled to both allies and adversaries that the United States would accept nothing short of complete victory. Shipyard managers maintained production schedules with military precision, monitoring every hour, every task, and every setback with a vigilance that mirrored the battlefield. Across the country, the labor force itself evolved into a hardened, highly experienced industrial army. The novices of 1942 had become master builders, capable of constructing complex warships with a confidence that few could have predicted. Women who had first learned welding only months before Pearl Harbor were now leading critical teams, handling intricate steelwork with unmatched precision. African American workers, though still battling discrimination and unequal pay in many facilities, rose to positions of skill and authority as their abilities proved indispensable. Union leaders, production supervisors, and federal officials often met in late-night sessions to coordinate quotas and solve bottlenecks, proving that collaboration, not conflict, defined America's wartime industrial spirit. These workers, united by necessity and driven by purpose, forged a workforce unlike any in the world. Technologically, the late-war shipyards became ground zero for some of the Navy's boldest innovations. Radar systems grew more compact and reliable, sonar improved dramatically, and anti-aircraft defenses became far more lethal. Engineers experimented with new hull shapes designed for speed, maneuverability, and reduced drag, while advances in metallurgy produced stronger, lighter steel that enhanced durability without sacrificing mobility. Power plants grew increasingly efficient as engineers refined boilers, turbines, and electrical systems. The shipyards embraced these changes with remarkable agility, often incorporating them into vessels already under construction, an achievement that would have been unthinkable in pre-war shipbuilding. The ability to absorb and implement cutting-edge technology at full production speed became one of America's most powerful advantages, ensuring its Navy evolved faster than the enemy could adapt. The logistical network feeding the shipyards expanded in parallel, becoming one of the greatest supply operations ever orchestrated. Railroad corridors moved with a near-martial rhythm, carrying raw materials, engines, and prefabricated modules from inland factories to coastal yards. Convoys of trucks delivered everything from hydraulic pumps to specialized wiring. Even inland mill towns, far removed from oceanfront activity, felt the war's pulse as they supplied the metal, tools, and equipment that made shipbuilding possible. The scale was staggering. Entire forests were harvested for scaffolding. Mountains yielded iron ore for steel. Chemical plants ran day and night to produce paints, lubricants, and protective coatings. America's geography itself became a weapon, transformed into a sprawling, interconnected industrial ecosystem that Germany, with its shrinking resources and overstretched infrastructure, could never match. Yet even as production soared, the emotional burden of the war weighed heavily on the shipyard communities. Tens of thousands of workers had family members fighting overseas, and the newspapers delivered constant reminders of the stakes. The brutal island campaigns in the Pacific, the push into Germany, the relentless struggle against U-boats still lurking in the Atlantic. Every casualty report sharpened the sense of urgency, reminding workers that ships were not abstractions. They were lifelines, carrying real men into combat and determining whether they returned home. This awareness gave new meaning to the final inspections, where teams meticulously checked every weld, every pipe, every bolt. A single flaw could doom a ship in enemy waters. Workers approached this phase with a combination of pride and solemn responsibility, aware that their craftsmanship might decide life or death for the sailors who would one day walk their decks. As American shipyards reached this extraordinary tempo, the strategic situation in the Atlantic transformed completely. German U-boat commanders, once the terror of the sea, now found themselves outmatched by a convoy system reinforced by powerful new escort groups supported by replenishment ships and long-range aircraft launched from escort carriers. Technological advancements, improved sonar, radar, depth charges, and coordinated air-sea tactics created a nearly impenetrable shield for Allied shipping. The sheer volume of vessels leaving American shipyards meant that even in areas where U-boats still posed a threat, the loss of a few ships no longer jeopardized entire supply chains. Hitler's strategy of starving Britain into submission unraveled as fast as America's shipbuilding accelerated. The hunters of the Atlantic had become the hunted. By the spring of 1945, it was clear to both friend and enemy alike that the United States had achieved something unprecedented. It had built a maritime force so large, so flexible, and so technologically superior that no Axis nation could hope to challenge it. What began as a desperate race to replace ships lost in the early years of the war had become a triumph of industrial might and democratic resolve. The shipyards had not merely supported the war, they had transformed it. And as the smoke of battle began to clear, the world realized that the waves themselves now favored the Allies, carried forward by fleets born from American steel, American skill, and American determination. The transformation of America's Pacific shipbuilding network took on an almost mythic urgency in the months after Pearl Harbor, when the realization settled in that the vastness of the ocean demanded not just ships, but waves of ships, fleets that could replace losses before the smoke cleared. Nowhere was this urgency felt more intensely than in the West Coast yards, where a mix of veterans, migrant laborers, Dust Bowl families, Filipino and Mexican workers, and women newly recruited from civilian life formed one of the most diverse industrial forces the nation had ever assembled. As Japanese forces advanced through the Western Pacific, the pressure on these yards became existential. Each carrier, destroyer, and cargo vessel was not just hardware, but a promise that America still possessed the means to project power across an ocean controlled by an enemy who had planned its expansion for a decade. The Pacific yards developed a rhythm unlike anything on the Atlantic seaboard. Here, workers labored beneath the glare of immense floodlights as if the war had grafted a permanent daylight onto the coast. The night shift became as crucial as the morning shift, with welders sending cascades of sparks into the darkness, like fireflies marking progress hour by hour. This relentless tempo created a new kind of industrial culture, one where time itself was redefined. People no longer thought in weeks or months. They thought in launches, in keels down, in sea trials. The shipyards became living clocks, measuring the narrow distance between Allied survival and defeat. Innovation flourished in this atmosphere of relentless necessity. Yards in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Bremerton, and Portland traded designs, shared blueprints, swapped foremen, and standardized processes in ways that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Rival companies, Panama Pacific, Todd, Kaiser, Mare Island, now cooperated through informal channels of communication, often begun with a midnight phone call from a supervisor who had found a faster way to lay pipe or align turbines. Efficiency spread laterally, not through military mandates, but through the restless creativity of builders hungry to beat yesterday's record. Perhaps the most visually striking change was the new dominance of women in Pacific Coast shipyards. While Rosie the Riveter became the propaganda symbol, the real story was more complicated and more powerful. Women who had never before touched industrial tools became experts in welding, riveting, drafting, and crane operation. Their hands, steady and precise, often produced cleaner weld seams than their male counterparts, a fact acknowledged quietly in yard reports but rarely celebrated publicly. The Pacific War effort became, in large measure, a demonstration of how quickly society could evolve when survival demanded it. Even with this surge in labor and innovation, the distances involved in the Pacific posed unique challenges. Equipment shipped from the East Coast took weeks to arrive. Steel shortages required creative substitution, and the constant threat of Japanese submarines lurking offshore forced yards to adopt elaborate security precautions. Workers underwent blackout drills, guarded by soldiers patrolling the perimeter, while anti-aircraft guns stood ready should the war suddenly shift onto American soil. Every clang of metal, every crane swing, every echo from a distant platform carried an undertone of urgency, a recognition that the ocean was vast, but the margin for error was not. Shipbuilders in the Pacific often wrote in their diaries about a strange psychological transformation, the sense that they were fighting the war at home, not observing it from across the world. A welder in Long Beach once described his work as joining steel to keep the ocean free, while a pipe fitter in Mare Island recalled that every destroyer escort he helped complete felt like a child leaving home to face danger before it was fully grown. These personal reflections, seldom shared outside the community of yard workers, reveal an emotional dimension to wartime production that statistics and tonnage cannot capture. Their work was not abstract, it was profoundly intimate. By late 1943, the results of this colossal mobilization became undeniable. Pacific yards began launching vessels at a rate that shocked even seasoned naval officers. Destroyers slid into the water weeks ahead of schedule. Escort carriers, once considered a complicated undertaking, began rolling out like clockwork. The ability to replace combat losses in real time shifted the psychological balance of the war. While Japanese shipyards struggled under bombing, scarcity, and bureaucratic rigidity, American yards became more agile with each passing month, turning speed itself into a strategic weapon. The Pacific shipbuilding miracle, though rarely labeled as such in official histories, became one of the decisive pillars supporting American military success. Without the night shift welders, The improvising engineers, the drafting room women who retraced blueprints until dawn, and the migrant workers who poured their lives into a war fought far from home. The U.S. Navy could not have evolved from a threatened fleet to a global force. In these yards, under the buzz of arc welders and the salt-stained wind, the war was not only supplied, it was shaped. Through their labor, the Pacific stopped being a barrier and became a pathway. By the spring of 1944, the consequences of America's shipbuilding surge had begun to ripple across every theater of the war. Convoys that once staggered under the weight of U-boat attacks now traversed the Atlantic with near impunity, reinforced by destroyers, escort carriers, and anti-submarine vessels emerging at an unprecedented pace from the shipyards. Each launch was a tangible counterpunch, a demonstration that Germany's strategy of attrition had failed. Commanders in London and Washington marveled at the consistency. Where previously weeks of effort might yield a single replacement ship, now multiple vessels arrived in days. This transformation was not accidental. It was the result of years of innovation, labor, and logistical orchestration that had turned production into a weapon as decisive as any battleship or aircraft. The relentless speed of production created a new psychological environment for both allies and adversaries. Sailors and soldiers saw supplies arriving faster than they could be consumed, instilling confidence in both leadership and frontline operations. German U-boat captains, conversely, faced the demoralizing realization that sinking a few merchant vessels no longer threatened the Allied war effort. For every loss, 2 or more ships would appear to fill the void. Intelligence reports circulated in Berlin spoke of industrial magic, a term tinged with frustration and disbelief. While Hitler's propaganda celebrated German ingenuity, his commanders faced a sobering truth. The enemy was outproducing them in a way that human and technological effort alone could not offset. Inside the shipyards, workers continued to push the boundaries of human endurance. The repetition of welding, riveting, and crane operations forged a rhythm that became both grueling and hypnotic. Yet within this physical labor lay ingenuity. Teams devised shortcuts, invented specialized jigs, and optimized assembly sequences without compromising safety or quality. Shipyard foremen encouraged cross-training so that any worker could step into multiple roles, ensuring that a single bottleneck could never halt production. The industrial choreography resembled a ballet, each motion calculated, each action purposeful, all directed toward the singular goal of overwhelming enemy capacity. The integration of women into critical production roles reached its zenith. By now, they occupied positions that had been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Engine room assemblers, electrical system testers, and even small group supervisors. Their contributions were essential to maintaining the frenetic pace demanded by global operations. Public awareness, encouraged by wartime propaganda, emphasized the patriotic nature of their work, yet within the yards themselves, respect stemmed from competence and reliability rather than ideology. These women, alongside experienced male craftsmen and migrant laborers, formed a uniquely efficient coalition whose output increasingly dictated the pace of the war. African American laborers also began to emerge from the margins, asserting indispensable skill in welding, machine work, and navigation system assembly. Wartime necessity began to break down some racial barriers in shipyards, with integrated crews appearing in places that had previously been segregated. Tensions remained, but the overriding priority of production forced collaboration, creating practical precedents that would reverberate long after the war ended. These yard experiences offered early glimpses into a society beginning to reconcile its ideals with the realities of national survival, demonstrating how industry and war could accelerate social change. Technological innovation remained constant, spurred by feedback from both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Radar masts were redesigned for faster installation. Anti-aircraft batteries were integrated during construction rather than retrofitted. Modular hull segments were perfected to allow pre-installation of complex machinery. These refinements meant that vessels were not only built faster, but were also more resilient, more versatile, and more capable upon entering service. America's industrial system had transformed from reactive to proactive, anticipating the needs of battle even before they emerged, a strategic advantage that Germany, could never replicate. Supply chains across the nation became increasingly synchronized. Steel mills, inland fabrication shops, chemical plants, and logistics hubs operated like an interconnected organism, each aware of its role in the larger mission. Even minor delays triggered immediate adjustments. Extra rail cars were dispatched, alternative suppliers sourced critical components, and maintenance crews worked round the clock to ensure that equipment failures did not stall production. The result was a seamless national effort that transformed raw materials into warships faster than any adversary could hope to counter. By mid-1944, Allied planners could rely on an almost continuous flow of vessels, turning logistical superiority into a decisive battlefield factor. By the close of this phase, the combined weight of America's shipyards had achieved what many had once considered impossible: a navy and merchant fleet so massive, agile, and resilient that losses were no longer existential. Where Hitler had hoped to use the Atlantic to strangle Britain, the ocean now pulsed with a tidal wave of American steel, carrying men, equipment, and supplies that could overwhelm any threat. Shipyards, once quiet centers of commerce, had become engines of destiny, shaping not only the course of the war, but the very strategy of the Allies. In the relentless clang of hammers and roar of welding arcs, history was being forged at a pace faster than the enemy could ever imagine. By the late summer of 1944, the United States shipyards had reached a level of output that defied comprehension. Across the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, production lines churned relentlessly, fueled by steel, electricity, and the unwavering determination of a workforce whose skill had been honed through years of intensive labor. Ships were no longer measured solely by tonnage. They were evaluated by speed, durability, and adaptability. Every vessel that left the slipway was an engineering triumph, a testament to the ability of American industry to convert raw material and human effort into precise instruments of war. Naval commanders now planned operations with confidence that logistical support would never falter, a certainty unimaginable in the chaotic early years of the conflict. Within the yards, innovation continued to accelerate. Foremen encouraged workers to propose modifications, often implementing them within days. Electrical wiring layouts were redesigned to simplify maintenance. Bulkhead structures were reinforced for greater resilience under fire, and anti-submarine defenses were integrated during construction rather than added as afterthoughts. This level of adaptability transformed the shipyards into experimental laboratories, where lessons from distant battlefields translated almost immediately into practical improvements. For the first time in history, industrial production and military intelligence merged into a continuous, self-correcting cycle. The workforce, meanwhile, had become a finely tuned human network. Teams of women, men, and minority laborers operated in coordinated shifts, their movements synchronized like clockwork. Each member understood not only their immediate task, but how it fit into the broader operation, whether assembling a turbine, fitting a sonar system, or welding hull segments. Cross-training ensured that bottlenecks rarely halted progress, while peer mentorship allowed novices to reach proficiency at unprecedented speed. This human infrastructure, discipline, skill, and collaboration, was as decisive as the machinery itself, and it became the foundation upon which America's industrial advantage rested. Technological advances continued to shape the fleet. Ships incorporated new radar systems capable of detecting submarines at longer ranges, anti-aircraft guns became more accurate and responsive, and hull designs were refined to improve speed and fuel efficiency. The integration of these innovations into vessels still under construction demonstrated the unprecedented flexibility of the shipyards. Germany, by contrast, faced severe limitations. Production rigidity, material shortages, and bureaucratic interference prevented similar rapid adaptation. The United States, through continuous industrial evolution, gained a strategic edge that transcended raw numbers. It built a navy that was faster, smarter, and more durable than its adversary could counter. The sheer scale of output reshaped global strategy. Allied forces could plan multi-theater operations with a level of logistical assurance previously unattainable. Convoys in the Atlantic became increasingly impervious to U-boat attacks as escort vessels, destroyers, and support ships arrived in waves. In the Pacific, amphibious assault ships and troop transports enabled rapid island-hopping campaigns, sustaining offensives thousands of miles from the nearest American base. The war's tempo accelerated, driven not solely by combat strategy, but by the ability of industrial America to supply, replace, and improve its naval assets at a pace no enemy could match. Even the human dimension of labor remained central. Workers endured grueling hours, yet the shared knowledge that every rivet and weld could save lives instilled profound motivation. Families of shipbuilders participated in support networks, providing meals, childcare, and moral sustenance that reinforced the industrial effort. Communities became extensions of the shipyards themselves, creating an invisible army on the home front whose sacrifices were as essential as those in the theater of combat. This alignment of civilian and military purpose exemplified a national resolve rarely seen in history. Logistics, previously the hidden engine of war, now stood as an overt strategic weapon. Railroads, ports, and inland factories formed a synchronized network that ensured raw materials flowed without interruption, while newly refined production schedules prevented bottlenecks. Even unexpected disruptions, equipment failures, labor shortages, or natural obstacles were absorbed with minimal impact due to adaptive planning. America's shipbuilding effort had become self-correcting, resilient, and relentless, turning the flow of production itself into a decisive factor shaping the outcome of battles. By the end of this period, it was undeniable. The United States had transformed from a hesitant supplier of vessels into a global industrial powerhouse capable of overwhelming any adversary. Shipyards, once considered peripheral to strategy, had become the unsung engine of victory. Their combined output not only replaced losses but also exceeded expectations, enabling the Allies to maintain momentum on every front. In every riveted seam, every welded plate, and every launch into the water, the power of coordinated industry was made manifest, a force that would carry the war toward its final conclusion. By late 1944, the American shipyards had become a force of nature, capable of producing a fleet so vast and versatile that it redefined the strategic possibilities of war. Every inch of waterfront space along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts was utilized to its fullest extent. Slipways stretched for miles, cranes swung in synchronized patterns like mechanical dancers, and yards operated around the clock under the glare of floodlights that made night indistinguishable from day. The sheer volume of vessels, destroyers, escort carriers, amphibious transports, cargo ships, and tankers was staggering. In operational terms, America no longer faced the prospect of loss. It faced the challenge of managing abundance. This abundance, however, required increasingly sophisticated coordination. Shipyard managers implemented hierarchical yet flexible systems to track every subcomponent, labor assignment, and milestone. Advanced scheduling charts covered walls from floor to ceiling, displaying the status of hull construction, machinery installation, and outfitting. Materials arrived with military precision. Steel plates, turbines, boilers, electronics, and armaments were staged in a sequence that minimized idle time. Workers internalized this choreography, moving with a fluid efficiency born of repetition and necessity. In this environment, delays were rare and swiftly corrected, and each completed vessel represented not just production but mastery over chaos. Technological integration accelerated as combat experience fed directly into production. Reports from returning convoys and Pacific campaigns highlighted vulnerabilities that shipbuilders corrected in real time. Radar and sonar systems were installed with improved wiring layouts. Hull plating was reinforced based on documented battle damage, and anti-aircraft mounts were strategically repositioned to maximize coverage. Modular construction methods allowed these modifications to be applied even to vessels mid-assembly, demonstrating a degree of agility that Germany's rigid industrial structure could not match. The result was a fleet that was not only numerically superior, but also increasingly optimized for survivability, efficiency, and versatility. Human ingenuity remained at the core of the shipbuilding miracle. Women and minority workers, initially welcomed out of necessity, became central to operations, demonstrating technical skill equal to or surpassing veteran craftsmen. On-the-job mentorship, cross-training, and shared problem-solving created a dynamic workforce capable of adapting to evolving construction challenges. Stories abound of young apprentices stepping into complex welding or electrical tasks under the guidance of experienced foremen, ensuring that production never faltered despite personnel fluctuations. This human adaptability became a strategic asset, turning every worker into a node in a vast, coordinated industrial network. The logistical chain feeding the shipyards grew into a national marvel. Railroads, ports, and factories formed a seamless system that ensured the continuous flow of raw materials, subassemblies, and tools. Even minor disruptions, broken machinery, delayed shipments, or labor shortages were absorbed and corrected within hours. Strategic prioritization meant that critical warships were always supplied first, while auxiliary vessels received necessary components without compromising production. In effect, the supply chain itself became a weapon of war, guaranteeing that every combat operation could rely on reinforcement and replacement at a scale no adversary could counter. Communities surrounding the shipyards mirrored the intensity of the work inside. Families, churches, and civic organizations provided food, childcare, and support networks, turning neighborhoods into extensions of the industrial effort. Blood drives, fundraisers, and volunteer initiatives strengthened morale and reinforced a collective understanding of purpose. The shipyard was no longer just a place of employment. It was a crucible of national identity, a space where ordinary citizens shaped history with their labor. This integration of civilian and military effort epitomized the total war mindset that defined American production in the final years of World War II. Across both oceans, the strategic impact of this production was unmistakable. Convoys that had once staggered under U-boat attack now sailed with near immunity, supported by destroyers and escort carriers whose arrival was almost continuous. In the Pacific, amphibious operations succeeded because fleets could be replenished faster than losses accrued. Even in secondary theaters, the sheer volume of ships allowed the Allies to extend their reach, maintain supply lines, and execute operations without the constant anxiety of scarcity. Production became not just a support function, but a decisive factor shaping the tempo and outcome of the war. By the close of 1944, America's shipbuilding effort had achieved a transformation that few had envisioned in 1940. From the chaos of an initial shortage, a national industrial machine emerged, capable of producing fleets faster than any adversary could destroy them. The shipyards had proven that human ingenuity, combined with organizational discipline, technological innovation, and sheer determination, could alter the course of history. In every riveted seam, welded plate, and launched hull, the United States demonstrated that its industrial heart had become as potent a weapon as the guns, torpedoes, and planes that sailed from its docks. By early 1945, the sheer scale of America's shipbuilding effort was staggering, but the human cost of sustaining such relentless production was profound. Workers endured long shifts, often 12 to 16 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. The physical toll was immense. Back injuries, burns, welding arcs that scarred skin, repetitive strain injuries, and exhaustion became daily realities. Yet despite these hardships, morale often remained high, fueled by a sense of purpose and the knowledge that every rivet and weld could save a sailor's life. Letters from the front lines arrived in the yards, telling stories of ships built in Richmond, Portland, or Long Beach carrying soldiers safely to battle, and these accounts reinforced the notion that industrial labor had become an extension of the battlefield itself. The emotional landscape of shipyard communities was equally complex. Families lived under the constant tension of war, balancing pride in their loved ones' contributions with anxiety over dangers both overseas and at home. Accidents in yards, though mitigated by rigorous safety protocols, remained inevitable, and the loss of a worker could ripple through the tightly knit industrial communities. Support networks, churches, neighborhood organizations, and volunteer groups emerged to provide meals, childcare, and emotional aid, transforming civilian neighborhoods into integral cogs of the war effort. In many ways, the home front became a second battlefield, where resilience and solidarity were as vital as steel and machinery. Technological innovation continued to accelerate under these conditions. Engineers and foremen collaborated closely, implementing improvements in hull design, machinery, and electronics without slowing production. Modifications that once would have required months of testing were now applied in real time, guided by feedback from sailors and officers returning from combat. This rapid iteration ensured that vessels entering the fleet were continually optimized for survivability, speed, and operational effectiveness. The ability to integrate frontline experience into production pipelines represented a unique strategic advantage, enabling the U.S. Navy to evolve faster than any Axis fleet could adapt. The integration of women into essential industrial roles reached its peak during this period. Female welders, electricians, crane operators, and machinists not only filled gaps left by men serving overseas, but often surpassed expectations in skill and efficiency. Their contributions reshaped the workforce, creating a precedent for gender roles in heavy industry and proving that competence, not gender, determined effectiveness. These women became symbolic of the nation's industrial resolve, embodying both the ingenuity and the sacrifice that defined wartime production. African American laborers also expanded their presence in shipyards, overcoming systemic barriers to occupy skilled positions critical to production. Segregation remained an issue in some facilities, but wartime necessity forced collaboration and integration in unprecedented ways. Skilled African American workers supervised teams, maintained complex machinery, and contributed to engineering improvements, demonstrating that inclusion was not only morally right, but strategically essential. These incremental social changes, forged under the pressure of global conflict, hinted at the post-war transformations that would reshape American society. The strategic impact of these efforts was visible across every theater of war. Convoys that had once staggered under constant threat now moved with security reinforced by newly launched destroyers, carriers, and supply vessels. In the Pacific, amphibious assaults succeeded with a consistency that could only have been achieved by the relentless output of American yards. Logistics, the silent, often invisible engine of military success, had been transformed into a dominant strategic advantage, allowing the Allies to dictate the tempo of operations and seize the initiative from Axis forces. Shipyard managers, foremen, and labor leaders understood that their work carried consequences far beyond industrial metrics. Each completed ship represented lives protected, operations sustained, and the broader momentum of Allied campaigns preserved. The recognition of this moral weight imbued the workforce with a deep sense of responsibility, transforming the act of labor into a form of patriotic sacrifice. In this way, shipbuilding became not only a testament to engineering prowess, but also an expression of national resilience and ethical commitment. By mid-1945, it was clear that America's industrial effort had decisively altered the course of the war. Shipyards had achieved an almost unprecedented combination of speed, scale, and innovation, producing fleets that could not only replace losses but exceed them in quality and capability. Yet the story of victory was incomplete without acknowledging the human dimension, the fatigue, the sacrifice, the relentless commitment of millions who labored in near obscurity. Their collective effort ensured that steel, machinery, and ingenuity combined to create a naval force capable of outmatching any adversary, demonstrating that industry, when harnessed with purpose and precision, could shape history itself. By the summer of 1945, the fruits of America's shipbuilding labor were no longer theoretical, they dominated the seas. Fleet carriers, destroyers, amphibious transports, and support vessels filled harbors and ports from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Every theater of war now reflected the relentless output of American yards. Atlantic convoys were shielded by a continuous stream of escorts. Pacific Island campaigns advanced with unprecedented speed, and supply lines to the farthest reaches of the globe remained uninterrupted. The war's momentum, long threatened by early setbacks, now clearly favored the Allies, a direct consequence of the industrial and human orchestration that had transformed shipyards into engines of destiny. The cumulative effect of technological refinement became particularly evident in the newly launched vessels. Radar and sonar systems, anti-aircraft installations, reinforced hulls, and modular engineering meant that ships were increasingly survivable and operationally flexible. The integration of lessons learned from the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific theaters allowed designers to anticipate the evolving tactics of enemy forces. By the time vessels reached the front, they were not simply tools of war. They were adaptive instruments, embodying the collective knowledge of both engineers and sailors. This fusion of practical experience with industrial capability created a fleet that was not only vast, but strategically superior in every measurable way. Human effort remained central to this triumph. The workforce, fatigued but resolute, continued to operate at remarkable efficiency. Women, minorities, and men who had spent years mastering new skills carried out their work with precision, understanding that each ship represented lives saved and campaigns sustained. The emotional stakes were palpable. Workers internalized the global impact of their labor, experiencing a sense of agency in a conflict fought thousands of miles from home. The synergy of purpose, skill, and perseverance turned ordinary industrial activity into an extraordinary national achievement. The strategic consequences of this unprecedented output were profound. German U-boats, once the scourge of Atlantic convoys, were increasingly neutralized by a fleet arriving faster than they could destroy it. In the Pacific, the island-hopping strategy succeeded because vessels could be replaced, repaired, and redeployed without interruption. Even secondary theaters benefited from the consistent arrival of transports and supply ships. Production had become a force multiplier. The industrial machine itself dictated the tempo of operations, allowing Allied forces to seize and maintain initiative on multiple fronts simultaneously. Shipyards had also become arenas of innovation in organizational and social structure. Cross-training and collaboration between engineers, foremen, and laborers maximized efficiency, while inclusion of women and minority workers expanded the pool of talent in ways that reshaped industrial norms. Safety protocols, rest schedules, and support networks demonstrated that maximizing human output required attention to both skill and welfare. These lessons, hard-earned during the crucible of war, would inform post-war industry and society, laying the groundwork for decades of technological and social development. Communities surrounding shipyards were inextricably linked to the success of the war effort. Churches, schools, civic groups, and volunteer organizations provided childcare, meals, and emotional support to the labor force, effectively extending the industrial machine into the civilian sphere. Families and neighborhoods bore their own burdens and sacrifices, understanding that every shift, every launch, and every completed vessel contributed to the survival of their country. This unity of purpose between home front and production floor reinforced the notion that victory was a collective endeavor, forged as much by industry as by combat. By mid-1945, the scale and efficiency of America's shipbuilding network had reached a point where strategic setbacks could no longer undermine the Allied war effort. Losses at sea, while inevitable, were rapidly mitigated by the constant output of vessels capable of replacing them. This industrial resilience allowed military planners to conduct operations with a level of confidence previously unimaginable, freeing strategic thinking from the constraints of scarcity. The Navy could act decisively, projecting force across oceans and enabling campaigns that would hasten the end of the conflict. The final lesson of this industrial triumph was clear. Victory had been won not solely on the battlefield, but in the shipyards, the factories, and the communities that sustained them. American ingenuity, organization, and determination had combined to create a naval force that Germany and Japan could not match, ensuring the Allies' dominance at sea. In the roar of welding arcs, the clatter of rivets, and the organized chaos of thousands of workers laboring in unison, the story of triumph was written in steel, a testament to what a nation could achieve when purpose, skill, and collective effort converged to shape history itself. By the summer of 1945, the final stages of World War II underscored the decisive impact of America's industrial effort. Shipyards that had once struggled to replace early war losses now operated as the backbone of Allied maritime dominance. Every hull launched, every deck welded, every engine installed represented more than production. It represented survival, strategy, and the collective will of a nation determined to end tyranny. The fleets of the Atlantic and Pacific were no longer just instruments of war. They were symbols of American ingenuity and resilience, proof that industrial capacity, when harnessed with purpose, could alter the course of history. The lessons of efficiency and innovation learned in the yards were unparalleled. Modular construction, rapid adaptation to technological developments, and streamlined logistics had turned shipbuilding into a near-perfect cycle of production and refinement. Designers and engineers had integrated lessons from combat into every stage of construction, creating vessels that were progressively more effective and resilient. This dynamic, iterative approach ensured that America's naval power was not only vast but evolving, capable of responding to challenges faster than any adversary could anticipate. Human effort remained at the core of this achievement. Millions of workers, men, women, minorities, and immigrants, had labored tirelessly, often under grueling conditions. The inclusion of women and African Americans in critical production roles represented not only practical necessity, but a profound social shift, challenging pre-existing norms and demonstrating the value of inclusion under pressure. Workers understood the stakes. The ships they built carried soldiers, sailors, and supplies, and their precision, skill, and dedication were instrumental in saving lives. In the process, ordinary citizens became architects of victory, their labor a direct force in shaping the outcome of global conflict. The strategic impact of this industrial might was unmistakable. Convoys moved with unprecedented security, amphibious campaigns progressed with sustained momentum, and supply lines remained unbroken across vast oceans. U-boat threats in the Atlantic were increasingly neutralized, while in the Pacific, replacement and repair of vessels allowed the Allies to maintain relentless pressure on Japanese defenses. America's industrial superiority effectively shifted the balance of power at sea, transforming logistics into a decisive element of military strategy and demonstrating that production itself could be a weapon as lethal as any torpedo or shell. Shipyards also became crucibles of technological and organizational experimentation. Innovations in radar, sonar, hull design, and anti-aircraft defenses were implemented at an unprecedented pace, while management practices, cross-training, and worker collaboration maximized human productivity. Communities surrounding the yards supported this effort with their own networks, providing essential services that enabled the labor force to perform at peak efficiency. The fusion of technology, human skill, and civic support exemplified the total war concept, showing that the victory of the Allied navies depended on far more than weapons alone. Even as the war approached its conclusion, the pace of shipbuilding never slowed. The yard's resilience and adaptability allowed them to respond to changing strategic demands, producing specialized vessels for amphibious assaults, repair, logistics, and direct combat. This flexibility ensured that every theater of war received the support it required, making shortages almost non-existent. The industrial machine had become self-correcting, reliable, and capable of projecting force on a global scale, reflecting a national commitment that extended from the front lines to the home front. The legacy of this achievement endured beyond the war. The innovations, organizational techniques, and lessons in workforce management developed during these years reshaped American industry in the post-war period. Veterans of the shipyards carried their skills into peacetime production, influencing technology, manufacturing, and infrastructure for decades. The inclusion of women and minorities foreshadowed social transformations, demonstrating that necessity could accelerate progress in ways that peacetime might never permit. Shipbuilding had become more than a wartime endeavor. It had forged the foundations of America's post-war economic and technological dominance. Ultimately, the story of America's shipyards is a story of national resolve, ingenuity, and collective sacrifice. Through innovation, skill, and sheer determination, a nation transformed raw materials into fleets that outpaced and outclassed any enemy. From the clang of rivets to the roar of engines, from the sweat of laborers to the brilliance of engineers, history was constructed on the slipways. The ships that sailed from American yards carried not just guns and fuel, but the weight of a global struggle, and the enduring proof that industrial power, harnessed with purpose and resolve, could shape the destiny of the world.